Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call to order this regularly scheduled meeting of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. The committee's chair, Councilmember Johnson, and I'm joined today by a quorum of committee members, Councilmember Schrader, Vice President Jenkins, and President Bender. And on our agenda today, we have two discussion items. The first is our 2020 legislative agenda and policy positions. So I will invite Mr. Ranieri up to present.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I'm Gene Ranieri, Director of Government Relations for the city. With me is Fatima Moore and Lauren Olson, and they will participate in any questions and in part of the presentation. Mr. Chairman, what we'd like to do today is we did send, and I think it's on your computers, a detailed markup of the legislative agenda. We're not going to go through that. We did prepare a very brief about 8 or 9 slides explaining what's in the report, and then try to meet with you individually or with your staff to go over if there are any changes or any questions you have, and hopefully at the next meeting approve the whole legislative agenda and policies. But we need to remind ourselves that this is an organic document and it can be amended at any one of the meetings before session or even during the legislative session. We've done that in the past because when things come up. If may, I'd like to go through the slides.
Please do.
Thank you. Fatima, I need help. Which one do we need? Well, just a little bit of overview. We have changes that proposed annually. And how we do this is we have department staff, city council, their staff, you yourselves, all suggest ideas for legislative policies and changes. And we have a formal team called the Legislative Liaison Team, or the Policy Liaison Team. That consists of people from every city department. They work on proposals. We have a whole form process. We go through an evaluation process. And then some of those, we sit down with the chair. Some of those proposals may not be ready for prime time, while others come forward for discussion. At our last meeting, I think we had about 10 proposals that were presented by city departments. And they are in this document today. And there are a few extra ones we'd like to go over with you.
Great.
Some of the new policies, and I think it's begin on page 6, is of the big document is the Metropolitan Council. Excuse me, I have to go back. I skipped over. Capital investment in there is the $20 million in language for the Upper Harbor Terminal is our first priority. Number 2, we show as a change, it's the $1.5 million for the Wellness Center, but that was approved last week, our last cycle. And one of the things we're going to be adding is recognition of state funding for the BRT, a $50 million request for the D line and another line that we would like to see done in 2020. And it's really important for transportation here. We do have some language in the big document. We're proposing to make it a little bit more explicit on the D line and $50 million for the BRT. We also are going to add more explicit language supporting the $240 million. I think it's $240 million for housing infrastructure bonds. $180 million for housing infrastructure and $60 million in general obligation bonds. And that's something that I know is a big need in our state, and I know that's coming from many of the housing advocates, and we like to have that in the next draft. And Ms. Moore's here to answer any questions.
Great. We have either a question or a comment from Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Mr. Ranieri, do you know or believe that the resignation of the Metropolitan Council chair will have any impact on this bonding request around transit?
Mr. Chairman, Vice President Jenkins, I don't think so, because I think there's strong support in some legislative corners, particularly in the House, the metro cities. I mean, we're all supportive. We've seen it's been successful, the A line, the C line, hopefully the D line. And I do know that there's been a lot of support for transit. We will have some difficulties, no doubt, during the bonding process because there's like $5 billion in requests and maybe only $1 billion plus budget, but the Metro Council has not received any funding for the last couple years for this, and I think it's something that hopefully there will be a new chair, it will be pushed, and also many of the members of the council will also be at the Capitol. So, it's a bump in the road, but I don't think it's going to hurt. Fatima, anything? Is that okay?
Great.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. Another thing beginning on page 8 are some new policies. And one would be local government. What we're suggesting there is that, remember last week when our Patrick Todd spoke, he talked about the equalization issue. We're going to suggest that as a policy and work closely with the Department of Revenue. Under capital investment, this came from the NCR department, and working closely with the Disabilities Committee or Commission, they're recommending and supporting that we support efforts by the state to fund and improve their accessibility to some of their policies and to some of their facilities. For example, I'm sorry. Skip ahead. Like for state parks, they're not always accessible to people who have disabilities. But we have to give some credit to the state Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. A couple of years ago, they received some planning money to try and redo the William O'Brien State Park to make it more accessible, the entire park accessible to people who are with disabilities. And they have that as a bonding project this year. And this came from our Disabilities Council to NCR to us. We also talked about this last week, was the contractor at risk. This would allow the city or any city to enter into an agreement where a contractor on a capital project would basically sign off and guarantee a fixed price. And if they can come in over, they need to adjust for that. And we did that in the Target Center, and I think it was done also on the U.S. Bank Stadium. And I think several of the state projects were also contractor at risk. On elections, we had, again, last week, thank you to summarize modifications to early voting. Basically, we have a sort of modified early voting process. What's being recommended here is going to early voting, where people can come in, vote. They don't go into envelopes, things of that nature. So it would be a true early voting. This is also being supported by the League of Cities and Metro Cities. The other issue is that I know the city clerk's office is concerned there could be several petitions next year to amend our charter, and under the current process, there are some modifications and clarifications proposed, and that would be particularly when it comes to defining who's a resident of the city. And this would be state law, it wouldn't be just applicable to us. And also this is being supported by the League of Cities. On data practices, this is aspirational. What we're suggesting, and I know again coming from the city attorney, is we need to rethink data practices because so much has changed. When we did this in 1970 for data practices, mostly everything was written, but now not all information is written. How do we have accessibility to documents, things of that nature? This would be a long-term project and would involve, as several legislators have told us over the summer, that we need to work with not only the city communities, but many of the privacy folks. So this will be a long-term project, and we have just in policies. This next policy, we have in our positions now that we oppose privatization of state prisons. We're recommending that it be modified to not only include that, but also oppose any private prison or detention center in Minnesota. And this came from NCR, from Ms. Rivero. And the housing policy, this is just adding in another place what we talked about at the distressed rental properties from last week. And public health and early development for children, modified some language to make it a little bit explicit that we'd like to see policies and programs that really encourage people not to drink sugar, to use sugary drinks or artificially sweetened drinks, particularly young children. And in environmental and resource, we support, and we had a discussion last week, the right to repair legislation as a new policy. Some of the policies that were enacted into law that should be stricken, as you go through the document, there are all sorts of strikeouts. The Upper Harbor TIF, the local government ability to change speed limits, which are beginning to happen across the metro region, an appropriation to assist in a complete count for the census, E-cigarettes are now included in the Clean Air Act. And then a couple of years ago, we heard some presentations from some medical students at the U of M who are trying to find a way to take unused and still usable medications and has set a depository for people who may be on low income who can use some of these certain kinds of pharmaceuticals. And that was passed into law. Mr. Chairman, I think that covers where we are now, and we'll stand for any questions.
Great. I think that's a solid overview of the changes in this document, and appreciate that. I wanted to see if we have any questions or comments from committee members. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's more of a comment, I think, on transit, which was back on slide 5. I don't think we need the slide, but I did just want to appreciate the legislature's, our delegation's approach to both really aggressively prioritizing funding for the D line as part of the bonding requests for this year, but then also building support for the real investment that our region needs to have in transit in the long term. And I think more and more, as we look at cities across the country, there is an additional piece of that, which is local funding for transit. And that's been a big topic of conversation in the past. And I think we're seeing, I just want to mention that, around the country, I think we're seeing declining rates of transit use, except in those places where cities are stepping up and bringing forward both capital and operating dollars to help support the system for local trips, which has been so overlooked regionally, not just here in our region, but across the country. So I think it's time for us, as we have the draft transportation action plan out soon and are collecting public comment on that. So far, the public comments on our transportation action plan have been transit. Like, our constituents want us collectively, they don't really make the distinction between the different branches of government that are representing them, to deliver better transit service, especially as we have continued to focus growth along transit corridors. So I'm excited about the way that the conversation is evolving. Of course, we were all so disappointed that there was no transportation bill last session. But as we regroup and think forward into the future, I think there's ways to rethink how the city is talking about transit funding for our constituents, especially for local trips. Again, especially because so much of the focus will be on this one line this year and really building up for the next finance year when we're talking about the bigger transportation packages. Thank you. If you want to say anything, that's welcome. Really more of a comment.
Mr. Chairman, I think it was well said. There's nothing to follow up on. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other comments or questions from committee members? Not seeing any. We appreciate the presentation, so I'll go ahead and move to receive and file. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, the motion carries. Move on to our second discussion item, which is receiving our federal, state, and local legislative updates. Mr. Ranieri.
Mr. Chairman, this will be very brief. A couple of things are happening. The fiscal year, as we know, started on October 1st. However, Congress has not passed an appropriations bill. They're working on them, and there may be, there's supposed to be 12 different appropriations bills. I think there's either going to be, it's called the new term, minibus, which are four bills put together into one bill. There may be 3 or 4 of those moving forward, but again, nothing has happened yet. The frightening part is that the continuing resolution expires on November 21st. That's 15 days away. That there probably will be an attempt to extend it. The House was thinking about to early January. The Senate is considering maybe February or March. And then given the fact of the investigations and the inquiries and the possibility of a trial, things could get pushed back. So there's a lot of concern about what this means for cities. Particularly, we have CDBG, some of our housing programs, some of our health programs are all federally funded. And one of the good things so far in looking at this, most of the appropriations bills are fairly clean. They don't have policy riders. Sometimes there's good policy riders or poison pills, and so far they've been absent of that, but we can't tell. At the state level, if you can switch gears for a second, we did have our first bonding tour last week. Thank you. Last week, it was management and budget. Their staff and the commissioner was in attendance. I think it went pretty well. It was we, the park board, the county, altogether, and I think the City of Brooklyn Center. On next Tuesday is the House of Representatives. Chair Murphy and her team and her committee will be not only looking at projects that were on our tour, I mean, our projects, well, as the ones we just mentioned, but also I think the Minneapolis Community College, and also projects in Golden Valley and Crystal. Did I forget any? And that will be a more extensive tour, and that's going to start, I think it's going to start at 7:30 at the Capitol on Tuesday. The Lieutenant Governor and Governor, we've invited, if they're going to be doing tours, they want to do capital budget tours too, we've invited them to the city. And then another thing coming in November or early December is the revenue forecast. Revenue for the last couple of months is up, but given uncertainty, we will see what the projection is for next year. And then again, a regional meeting next week, Metro Cities and League of Cities is next Thursday. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that update. And just for committee members, I know some committee members have attended in the past these capital investment tours. If you haven't, or if you're willing to again, it would be great to have you there. I know it really means a lot to our legislators as well to see local leaders there talking about the projects that we're seeking funding for, and the importance to our communities and our residents on that. So any additional comments or questions from committee members? Mr. Ranieri? No?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think so.
Perfect. All right. Well, I will go ahead and move to receive and file. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, the motion carries. And with no further business before us, our meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.